I said to the celebrant, "Keep the champagne cold. We're still having a party." She stared at me like I'd gone mad. And maybe I had. But I was 63 years old. I'd booked the venue at Waiheke Island 9 months in advance. I paid $11,000 out of my own retirement savings, and my daughter had just sent me a message saying she wasn't coming to her own wedding. Let me go back a bit. My name is not important. What is important is that I am a retired schoolteacher from Tauranga, widowed 8 years ago when my wife passed from a stroke, and the only family I had left in this world was my daughter, Eloise. She was 31, worked in marketing in Auckland, and 3 years ago she had introduced me to the man she wanted to marry, a fellow named Wade Kempton. Wade was 34, originally from Christchurch, and he worked in commercial real estate. Tall, reasonably well-spoken, a bit too fond of talking about property prices, but I thought, well, that's his job. I kept my opinions to myself. Eloise was happy. That was enough for me. The wedding was set for the second Saturday in March. We'd rented a beautiful old homestead property on Waiheke Island, the kind of place with wooden verandas and pohutukawa trees right down to the waterfront. Eloise had been planning it for over a year. Invitations had gone out to 64 guests. The caterer had been booked. A photographer from Wellington had been paid a deposit. The flowers, white ranunculus and native ferns, had been ordered months in advance. My job, as father of the bride, was to pay for it and show up. Which I did willingly. I put aside $40,000 specifically for this. Not because I had to, but because Eloise's mother never got to see her daughter get married, and I wanted to honor that somehow. I wanted the day to be right. I flew from Tauranga to Auckland the Thursday before, took the ferry across to Waiheke on Friday afternoon, and checked into the accommodation we'd booked for the wedding party. That evening, we had a small dinner, just close family and the wedding party. Wade sat across from me and we talked about the rugby. He seemed relaxed. Happy enough. Eloise was glowing. She hugged me before I went to bed and said, "Thanks, Dad. This is really happening." That was Friday night. Saturday morning I woke at 6. Old habit from 30 years of getting to school before the bell. I made a cup of tea, sat on the veranda, and watched the light come up over the Hauraki Gulf. The water was still. A few boats out. It was a genuinely beautiful morning. The kind of morning that makes you think, right, everything is going to be fine. At 8:30 I showered and dressed. The ceremony was at 11. I had my suit laid out, a dark navy one I'd bought for the occasion in Queen Street, with a small silver fern lapel pin that had been my father's. I remember thinking how much my wife would have loved this day. She would have been fussing over Eloise's hair and crying before breakfast. At 9:47, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Eloise. I almost didn't read it immediately. I thought it was probably something about buttonholes or the seating chart. But something made me look down. "Dad. I'm so sorry. I can't go through with it. Please don't be angry. I love you. I'll explain everything. I just can't." I read it 3 times. I sat down on the edge of the bed. I set the phone on the knee of my pressed trousers and I looked at the wall. There was a painting of Rangitoto on it, done in watercolor, not a very good one. I stared at it for what felt like a long time. Then I called her. She didn't answer. I called again. Straight to voicemail. I texted back, "Eloise. Ring me immediately." Nothing. I stood up. I walked to the window. Outside, the caterers were arriving, unloading trays. The florist's van was parked on the gravel. One of the groomsmen was crossing the lawn in a polo shirt, laughing at something on his phone. Everything was in motion. The machine of this wedding was already running, and I was the only person who knew the whole thing was about to fall over. I made a decision. I walked downstairs, found the celebrant, a capable woman named Margaret who had been highly recommended, and I took her aside near the kitchen doorway. I told her quietly that there had been a development and the ceremony might not proceed as planned. I asked her to wait. I asked her not to say anything to the guests yet. Then I found Wade. He was in the bridal party getting ready room at the back of the homestead. He was already in his suit, a pale gray one, looked good on him actually, and he was having a beer with his best man. At 9:50 in the morning. Which I noted but did not comment on. I asked his best man to give us a moment. When we were alone, I showed Wade the message. I watched his face. He didn't look shocked. That was the thing I noticed immediately. He didn't look shocked. His jaw tightened. He looked down at the floor, then back up at me. And he said, "I was afraid of this." I said, "Afraid of what, exactly?" He sat down. He set his beer on the dressing table. And then he told me. He and Eloise had been struggling for nearly a year. There had been problems, he was vague about what kind, initially, and about 4 months ago, Eloise had told him she needed some space. He had thought she meant a few weeks. She had apparently meant something different. He knew she had been spending time with someone else. A colleague. Someone from her workplace. He hadn't confronted her about it directly because, and these were his words, he didn't want to make it real. I sat with that for a moment. I said, "Did you know this was a possibility today?" He looked at me with the eyes of a man who has been trying very hard not to know something. "I hoped it wasn't," he said. That's not the same thing, I thought. But I didn't say it. I thanked him for telling me. I told him to stay in the room for now. And I walked back out into the hallway, where Margaret was waiting for me with an expression of considerable professional concern. I looked at her. I looked out through the glass doors at 64 people beginning to take their seats on the lawn, family from both sides, friends from Auckland, a couple of Eloise's university mates who'd flown in from Dunedin. My brother Malcolm had driven up from Napier with his wife. My wife's sister had come from Palmerston North. They were all sitting there in the morning sun, fanning themselves with the programs, expecting a wedding. All of that food. All of those flowers. All of that music queued up on a playlist. $11,000 of venue. Years of planning. And my wife not here to see any of it. And I thought, I am 63 years old. I have been a teacher my entire working life. I have managed classrooms full of teenagers at their most chaotic and unreasonable. I am not going to fall apart in a hallway on Waiheke Island. I turned to Margaret and I said, "There will be a ceremony. But the party is still happening. Tell the catering team to begin service. I'll speak to the guests." She blinked. "Are you certain?" "We've paid for everything," I said. "The food, the band, the venue. The champagne is already cold. These people have traveled. Some of them came from the South Island. They're not going home without lunch." She gave me a long look. Then she gave me a slow nod. "Right then," she said. "I'll let the kitchen know." I straightened my jacket. I checked my lapel pin. And I walked out onto that lawn. The murmur that went through the guests as I walked up to the microphone was something I can only describe as pre-wedding excitement slowly curdling into confusion. People were looking behind me for the bridal party. Children were fidgeting. An older woman near the back was still taking photos of the flowers. I tapped the microphone once. "Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I know you've all made a great effort to join us, and I genuinely appreciate each and every one of you." I paused. This morning, I received a message from my daughter. She has decided that she is not able to go through with the wedding today. The silence was absolute. I mean that, absolute. Not a murmur, not a chair scraping, nothing. 64 people holding their breath. She is safe. She is not unwell. She has made a decision, and I respect her right to make it, even though the timing is, well, the timing is what it is. A few people began to shift. I could see my brother on his feet, half standing, face creased with concern. Now, I said. We have a homestead full of food that the caterers have been preparing since yesterday afternoon. We have a very good band who are ready to play. We have champagne that is cold, and a view of the Waiheke Gulf that I paid $11,000 for and I intend to enjoy. So I would like to invite all of you to stay, have something to eat and drink, and celebrate, if not a wedding today, then at the very least the fact that we are here, together, on a beautiful morning in the Waiheke Gulf. Another moment of silence. And then my brother Malcolm started to clap. And then others did. And within 30 seconds the whole lawn was clapping, and the band, bless them, they read the room, started playing something warm and easy, and the catering staff began weaving through the tables with trays of food, and people started talking. I stepped away from the microphone. I walked to the edge of the veranda. I held onto the railing and I breathed. My brother appeared beside me. He put his hand on my shoulder and said nothing for a while. That's a Kiwi quality I have always appreciated. We know when words aren't needed. Eventually he said, "You all right?" "Not entirely," I said. "But I will be." "Good man," he said. We stood there together looking at the water, and the party went on behind us. I should tell you about the rest of that day, because parts of it were genuinely lovely, even though the whole situation was deeply painful. The food was exceptional, the caterers had done a magnificent job. The band played for 3 hours. People danced. Wade's parents, to their great credit, stayed the whole afternoon and were gracious and warm to everyone, including me. Wade himself came out after about an hour, changed into casual clothes, and sat with his family. He didn't say much. But he stayed. I respected that. Eloise called me at 2 in the afternoon. I stepped away from the party to take it. She was crying. She told me she was sorry. She told me she had been trying to tell herself for months that she could do this, that she could make it work with Wade, that what she was feeling for someone else was just a phase or a weakness or something she could push past. She said the night before the wedding she had finally admitted to herself that she couldn't. That marrying Wade while feeling what she was feeling would have been wrong, wrong to him, wrong to her, wrong to everyone. I listened. I let her finish. Then I said, "Why didn't you tell me this months ago?" She didn't have a good answer for that. She said she didn't want to upset me. She said she didn't want to let me down. She said she kept hoping things would sort themselves out. I said, "Eloise, I'm your father. I have been your father for 31 years. The only thing in this world that could truly let me down is if you made yourself miserable to spare my feelings. That would break my heart far more than this." She cried harder. I waited. Then I said, "I love you. I need a few days. But I love you." She said, "I love you too, Dad." I went back to the party. I drank a glass of champagne. I danced, badly, but sincerely, with my wife's sister, who held my hand very tightly. I said goodbye to everyone as they left in the late afternoon, and I thanked them for coming, and almost every single one of them said something kind. That was the day. That was how it ended, not with the wedding we'd planned, but not with nothing either. Now let me tell you what happened 3 weeks later. I had come back to Tauranga. I was getting on with things the way you do, pottering around the garden, visiting a maid in Papamoa, doing the small ordinary things that hold you together when something larger has knocked you sideways. I had spoken to Eloise twice on the phone. We were finding our way back to normal. She had told me a little more about the man she had feelings for. His name was Joel, he worked in her office, and they had been friends for 2 years before it became something else. She said she wasn't sure what would happen there, but that she knew she'd made the right choice. I was trying to believe her. Then one Tuesday evening, just after 5 o'clock, there was a knock at my front door. I opened it, and Wade was standing on my doorstep. He was in jeans and a work shirt, and he looked like he hadn't been sleeping well. His face was drawn and there were dark circles under his eyes. He said, "I know I'm probably the last person you expected to see. I'm sorry for not calling first. Can I come in?" I considered him for a moment. I said, yes. Come in. We sat in the kitchen. I made tea. There is something about the act of making tea in a difficult moment that gives both parties a moment to breathe, and I am always grateful for that particular British inheritance. He told me why he had come. He had been doing some thinking since the wedding. A lot of thinking. He said that in a week since, he had started to acknowledge some things he had been avoiding. He told me that the relationship with Eloise had been struggling for longer than he'd let on to me. He told me that he had known, genuinely known on some level, that she had been pulling away for months, and that instead of having an honest conversation, he had just kept pushing forward, booking more things, planning more things, telling himself that once they were married it would settle down. He told me that the night before the wedding, about 10 o'clock, Eloise had come to him and tried to tell him how she was feeling. Really tell him. And that he had told her she was just nervous, it was normal, it would all be fine. He had talked her back from the edge. Until the next morning, when she found she couldn't go through with it. I listened to all of this. I kept my hands around my mug of tea. Then he said something that surprised me. He said, I think part of me was more committed to the idea of the wedding than I was to understanding what Eloise actually needed. And I want you to know that I understand that now. I'm not here to blame her. I just wanted to tell you that. I was quiet for a while. I said, that's a big thing to admit. He nodded. Yeah, he said. It took me a while. We talked for another hour, sitting in my kitchen in Tauranga. We talked about Eloise, about the year they'd had, about the ways a relationship can quietly come apart while both people keep pretending otherwise. He didn't try to convince me of anything. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. I think he just needed to say it to someone who had been there. To make it real to himself. When he left, I shook his hand at the door. I said, take care of yourself, Wade. He said, you too. And, thank you for what you did at the reception. Keeping it going. I thought it was the right thing to do. I'm glad you did it. I watched him get into his car and drive off down my street. Then I closed the door and stood in my hallway for a moment. What he had told me changed something in my understanding. Not of Eloise, I had already begun to come to terms with her choice. But of how easy it is for people to let things drift, to not say the thing that needs saying, to keep moving forward because stopping feels too hard or too frightening or too uncertain. Wade had known something was wrong. Eloise had known something was wrong. And neither of them had said it clearly and directly, not until she was standing in a room the morning of her wedding with 64 people sitting on a lawn waiting. That cost everyone something. Including me. Now I need to tell you the last part. 6 weeks after the wedding I was at a Saturday morning market in Mount Maunganui. My mate had dragged me along looking for smoked fish. I was standing near a coffee cart with my flat white, watching the harbor, doing my best impression of a man who is completely fine. My phone rang. Eloise. Dad, she said. Can you talk? Go ahead, I said. There was a pause. Joel is engaged, she said. Has been engaged. He's been with someone for 4 years. I didn't know. He never told me. He let me think, he let me believe that what was happening between us was, she stopped. Her voice broke. Dad, I called off my wedding for someone who was never available. I closed my eyes briefly. Then I opened them and I looked at the harbor and the boats out on the Tauranga harbor and the blue of the Bay of Plenty beyond, and I thought about how life has a way of teaching you things at the highest possible price. I said, come home, sweetheart. Come home this weekend. She came. She stayed 5 days. We walked the mount every morning. We cooked together in the evenings. We talked, properly talked, in ways we hadn't in years. She cried. I let her cry without trying to fix it. I made tea. I told her about her mother, about some of the hard years her mother and I had been through, about the times we had doubted things and chosen each other anyway. I did not say, I told you so. I did not say, "You should have handled this differently." I was her father. My job was to be there. On her last evening, we sat on the back deck watching the sun go down over the Kaimais. She had a glass of wine. I had my tea. We'd been sitting in comfortable silence for a while when she said, "I'm sorry, Dad. For all of it. For the wedding, and the money, and having to stand up there and..." "Stop," I said. "The money is gone and it doesn't matter. What matters is what you do next." She looked at me. "You made a complicated situation in a panic," I said. "So did Wade, in his way. So did Joel, in the worst way. None of you were honest enough, soon enough. That's the thing to learn from. Not the falling apart. The falling apart happens to everyone. The lesson is to say the true thing earlier, even when it's terrifying. Especially when it's terrifying." She was quiet for a long time. The light faded. The Kaimais went from gold to purple to gray. Then she said, "Okay. Okay, Dad. It has now been 8 months since that morning on Waiheke Island. Eloise is doing well. She moved to a different job, not the same office where Joel worked. She's seeing someone new, carefully, without rushing. She called me last week to tell me she had been accepted into a part-time postgraduate program in communications at the University of Auckland. She sounded, for the first time in a long time, genuinely light. Wade, I heard through a mutual connection, is doing reasonably well. He moved back to Christchurch for a while and then back to Auckland. I have not spoken to him since he sat in my kitchen. But I think of that conversation occasionally. I think of a young man who sat across from me and told me, without being asked, that he had been wrong in the way he'd handled things. There was integrity in that. As for me, I still have the lapel pin. I still have the suit. I have a lot of photographs from that day that the photographer sent through anyway, because she was a kind and professional person. Photographs of 64 people eating and laughing and dancing in the sunshine at a homestead on Waiheke Island on a perfect autumn Saturday. There is no photograph of a ceremony. But there are photographs of my wife's sister dancing with my brother on the veranda. There is a photograph of me standing at the microphone. You cannot see my face clearly in that one. I'm glad about that. I keep them in a folder, but I have not looked at them often. Maybe I will, in time. What I have come to understand from all of this, and I say this as a man who spent 30 years standing in front of young people trying to give them something useful to carry into their lives, is this: honesty is not cruelty. Saying the hard thing early is an act of respect, not an act of abandonment. When we stay silent about the truth because we are afraid of the consequences, we are not being kind. We are kicking the consequence down the road, making it larger and harder and more damaging for everyone it eventually lands on. Eloise was not a bad person. Wade was not a bad person. Joel, in his way, was simply a person who chose comfortable dishonesty over a difficult truth, and that choice left wreckage in its wake. We teach young people to be brave in big obvious ways. To stand up to bullies. To own their mistakes. But we do not talk enough about the quieter courage of saying a hard true thing to someone who matters to you, before the situation has grown so large that saying it costs everyone far more than it should have. 63 years old. I thought I had seen most of what life had for me. A career, a marriage, a loss, a retirement. I did not expect to be standing at a microphone on Waiheke Island telling 64 people that the wedding was off but the party was still on. But here we are. And if I am honest, and at my age I try, above all else, to be honest, I am proud of the way I handled that morning. Not because I was brave in some grand sense. But because when something fell apart that I could not control, I chose to look at what was still intact and work with that. The food was still there. The people were still there. The light on the Hauraki Gulf was still there. That is usually enough to begin with. In my experience, it usually is.